December 19th, 1944. A pale winter light seeped through the broken windows of a former French barracks in Verdun. The air inside was heavy, not just with cigarette smoke and the bitter tang of coffee, but with a deeper, more palpable tension. Around a long wooden table, the top Allied generals gathered, papers and maps scattered before them, ashtrays brimming, pencils clutched in tired hands. Not one of them smiled. Only 3 days had passed since over 200,000 German troops had struck the American lines in the Ardennes, and the shock was still raw. Allied intelligence had dismissed the possibility of a major German counterattack, insisting the Reich was too depleted to mount one. Now, entire units were being encircled or wiped from existence. Messages of shattered regiments and severed communications arrived faster than anyone could process. Somewhere in Belgium, the 101st Airborne was trapped in Bastogne. If it fell, German tanks could slice through the Allied front, dividing the armies and possibly reaching the coast. Dwight D. Eisenhower, Supreme Allied Commander, sat at the head of the table, eyes tracing the network of colored arrows marking troop movements across the map. The room was thick with low, anxious murmurs until he lifted his head. His voice broke through the hum of tension. How soon? Could a force move north to relieve Bastogne? A heavy silence followed. Generals stared at their maps, running calculations in their minds, distances, fuel, roads, weather, units already engaged in battle. Pulling entire divisions from the line, repositioning them across icy terrain, and throwing them into combat on such short notice was a nightmare of logistics, an exercise usually confined to war colleges. No one spoke first. Then George S. Patton did. I can strike with 2 divisions in 48 hours. Heads turned sharply. Some officers stared, thinking it must be a bluff, another audacious claim meant to impress Eisenhower. 48 hours to withdraw multiple divisions, pivot a whole army, move more than 100,000 men and thousands of vehicles over frozen roads, and attack entrenched German positions. It sounded impossible, even insane. Yet Patton's expression betrayed no arrogance. He was calm, deliberate, certain. Unlike the others, he had anticipated this moment, and had been quietly preparing for it for 11 days. To understand, one must return to December 9, 1944, 10 days before Verdun. At U.S. Third Army headquarters in occupied France, routine operations hid an underlying tension. Patton's forces were advancing toward Germany, planning further operations in the Saar region. On the surface, victory seemed inevitable. The German army appeared to be fracturing, and many senior commanders believed the war in Europe might soon end. Colonel Oscar Koch, Patton's chief of intelligence, saw otherwise. That day he entered Patton's office carrying a stack of reports, maps, and decrypted communications. Koch was meticulous, cautious, unflappable, but urgency glimmered in his eyes. For weeks, he had tracked German troop movements along the Western Front, and a troubling pattern had emerged. 15 German divisions had disappeared. These were not depleted remnants but full-strength formations, including armored units with hundreds of tanks. Withdrawn from the front lines, their whereabouts were unknown to Supreme Headquarters. The official line was dismissive. The divisions were held in reserve. Koch disagreed. He knew the Wehrmacht's behavior well, and this was no ordinary reserve. It was concentrated offensive power, a force waiting to strike. Pointing to the Ardennes on the map, he explained the danger. Only 4 American divisions held a sector that required 12. The terrain was punishing: dense forests, narrow twisting roads, and frozen ravines. Intelligence had ignored it, reasoning that no commander would attack there in December. Koch reminded Patton of history. In 1940, the Germans had done exactly that, driving through the Ardennes, crushing French and British forces, and reaching the Channel in 6 weeks. The terrain that many considered a natural barrier had once been the gateway to catastrophe. Koch's evidence went far beyond missing divisions. Radio chatter in the Ardennes had spiked. prisoners reported new units arriving behind German lines. Locals spoke of increased patrols, nighttime convoys, and the distant rumble of armored vehicles moving under cover of darkness. Slowly, a troubling picture took shape. Patton listened, his jaw tightening as Koch presented his findings. Then he asked the question that mattered most: if you're right, when will they strike? Without hesitation, Koch estimated an offensive within the next 2 weeks. Patton picked up the phone and called General Omar Bradley, his immediate superior, laying out the assessment: missing panzer divisions, unusual troop movements, a dangerously thin American line in the Ardennes. Bradley listened politely but remained skeptical. Intelligence at Supreme Headquarters argued the same point: Germany lacked the strength for a major blow. The war, they insisted, was entering its final phase. Bradley advised caution. Patton ended the call slowly, exchanging a glance with Koch that said more than words. Then Patton gave a single, decisive order: start planning. From that moment, while the Third Army pressed its offensive in the Saar, a secret operation unfolded behind the lines. Under Koch's guidance, Patton's staff began drafting 3 detailed contingency plans for a rapid pivot north if the Germans launched their attack. Every aspect was considered. Truck routes were mapped with precision, fuel stocks prepositioned for quick redistribution, artillery earmarked for fast redeployment, infantry assigned to exact staging areas and movement schedules. Timelines were broken down by the hour. Every plan depended on coordination and precision on a scale few had ever imagined. 3 scenarios were prepared: Plan A for an attack from one direction, Plan B for a different approach, and Plan C for any unforeseen circumstance. Each plan covered not only troop movements but logistics, communications, and the chaos of pulling units from ongoing operations. Some of Patton's officers questioned the wisdom of diverting attention from active operations to hypothetical emergencies 100 miles away. Why prepare to abandon an advance that was already succeeding? But they obeyed. Patton's judgment outweighed reports from higher command. On December 12, he summoned his senior commanders and issued unexpected instructions: be ready to disengage on very short notice. He offered no explanation, no mention of missing German divisions or a possible offensive through snow-covered forests. They exchanged wary glances, but orders were orders. By December 15, Third Army stood alone among Allied forces with a detailed plan to react to any Ardennes offensive. Other commands focused solely on their advances and the countdown to Christmas. Then, at 5:30 a.m. on December 16, the quiet of winter shattered. German artillery opened across an 80-mile front. Thousands of shells rained down, cutting communications and obliterating forward positions. Infantry followed, then tanks, 3 armies, over 200,000 men, crashing into 4 overstretched American divisions. Units expecting a quiet sector or a respite from battle were thrown into fire. Early reports at SHAF and Bradley's headquarters were dismissed as minor counterattacks. Only hours later did the full scale become undeniable. The 106th Infantry Division, fresh to combat, was decimated. 2 regiments were surrounded and surrendered, marking the largest mass capitulation of U.S. troops in Europe. At Third Army headquarters, Patton's reaction was calm. Reviewing the initial reports, he turned to Koch. "You were right. What's their objective?" Koch analyzed the attack patterns, thrust directions, and key road junctions. One conclusion emerged: Bastogne. From there, the Germans could push toward the Meuse River and Antwerp, threatening to split the Allied armies. Patton nodded once. "Get me General Gaffey. Execute the contingency plans." While other commands were still debating the unfolding disaster, Third Army was already in motion. Units disengaged in the Saar, artillery shifted, traffic officers reversed flows of men and equipment. The emergency that had blindsided everyone else was one Patton had anticipated and prepared for. 3 days later, the generals would gather at Verdun. Eisenhower entered the meeting fully aware that the German assault, as threatening as it was, also offered a rare opening. The enemy had abandoned strong defensive positions and now exposed their flanks. If the Allies could move swiftly, they might turn what seemed like disaster into a decisive counterstroke against Hitler's last gamble in the West. But speed was critical. Each passing hour allowed the Germans to deepen their penetration. Around the table, generals wrestled with the harsh arithmetic of logistics. They calculated the time needed to disengage divisions, reroute supplies, and reassign priorities. A counterattack within days sounded almost fantastical. Then Patton spoke. 2 divisions ready to move north in 48 hours, 3 in 72. Eisenhower stared. Patton's boldness was legendary, but this was on another level. Failure here could mean the destruction of the 101st Airborne and supporting units in Bastogne. "This is no time for theatrics," Eisenhower said. "If we promise relief and it doesn't arrive, those men die." Patton met his gaze evenly. "Ike, the orders are already given. Third Army is disengaging now. We have 3 contingency plans ready. I've anticipated this attack for 11 days. The room absorbed the weight of that declaration in stunned silence. The offensive that had taken SHEF and Bradley by surprise, that had shattered divisions overnight, had been foreseen and planned for. Eisenhower, who knew Patton well enough to read the man's bluff from his seriousness, nodded slowly. "All right, George. Move." Patton left the conference and picked up a phone at Third Army headquarters. 2 words were enough. "Play ball." Those words set in motion the machinery Koch and Patton had constructed. Orders flashed through radio networks and telephone lines. Convoys loaded men and equipment. Tanks, armored vehicles, artillery, trucks, jeeps, fuel trucks, ambulances, all began moving north, threading through roads clogged with retreating units, wounded soldiers, and fleeing civilians. Military police worked tirelessly to keep traffic flowing, a delicate ballet under the harshest conditions. The 4th Armored Division led the advance, followed by the 26th Infantry Division and other formations. Over 133,000 vehicles were in motion. Snow fell steadily, roads froze, engines stalled, and soldiers braved bitter cold, their fingers raw and faces stung by wind. Yet the army moved relentlessly. Night and day, headlights crawled across narrow winter roads, command posts shifted, supply lines twisted and reformed to feed the new axis of attack. Other Allied commands were still trying to grasp the scale of the German assault, organizing their response on the fly. Third Army, by contrast, was already executing a plan conceived days in advance. By December 21st, the lead elements of the 4th Armored Division had reached positions for the push toward Bastogne, covering more than 100 miles in under 48 hours while disengaging from ongoing combat in some of the harshest winter conditions Europe had seen in decades. What outsiders would later call miraculous was, in reality, meticulous preparation. On December 22nd, Third Army launched its counteroffensive. The fight toward Bastogne was brutal. German forces had fortified villages, ridges, and crossroads, turning them into strongpoints. Tank engagements erupted in frozen fields, muzzle flashes cutting through the snow. Infantry pushed through ice-laden woods, every breath forming clouds in the frigid air. American units advanced, were pushed back, regrouped, and advanced again. Inside Bastogne, the 101st Airborne and attached units endured constant bombardment. Supplies were stretched thin. Ammunition rationed. Medical resources strained to the limit. That day, German emissaries approached under a flag of truce, demanding surrender. Brigadier General Anthony McAuliffe, acting commander of the 101st, responded with a single word: "Nuts!" The defenders clung to hope, trusting relief was coming. 4 days later, at 4:50 p.m. on December 26, First Lieutenant Charles Bogus, commanding the Sherman tank Cobra King of the 4th Armored Division, broke through the last German positions near the village of Ardennes. His vehicle linked physically with elements of the 101st, forging the literal connection between besieged defenders and their rescuers. The siege of Bastogne had been broken. Patton called Eisenhower immediately. "We're through to Bastogne." The relief corridor was narrow and under constant threat, but Third Army held firm. Supply trucks streamed into the battered town, bringing ammunition, food, and medical aid. After 8 days of isolation and relentless pressure, the paratroopers finally had the resources they needed to continue holding Bastogne. The Battle of the Bulge raged on into January, but the Germans never reached the Meuse. Their timetable unraveled, and their last great gamble in the West ended in failure. Yet the cost to the Americans was staggering: over 19,000 killed, more than 47,000 wounded, and roughly 23,000 captured or missing. It was the bloodiest single battle the U.S. Army had ever faced. Even those terrible numbers could have been far higher. Had Bastogne fallen, had the 101st Airborne and other defenders been overwhelmed, German armor could have seized the critical road junction, driving deep into Allied territory. The front might have split, chaos would have spread through command networks and supply lines, and the final months of the European war might have played out very differently. Patton's rapid counterattack did more than rescue a single town, it disrupted the entire German strategy. After the war, American officials studied the intelligence failure that had allowed the German build-up to go largely unnoticed, or dismissed. How had 15 divisions vanished from the order of battle without triggering alarms at the highest levels? How had over 200,000 troops and vast amounts of equipment been assembled for a major offensive while most Allied leaders remained convinced the enemy was collapsing? The uncomfortable truth was that someone had seen it coming. Colonel Oscar Koch had tracked the divisions, analyzed their movements, and predicted not just a German offensive but its likely direction and objective. His warnings were systematic, based on careful analysis of multiple sources, not guesswork. The reports had reached Bradley, SHAF, and other headquarters, yet they were largely set aside. It wasn't pure incompetence, it was assumption. Many senior officers believed the war in Europe was effectively won. Any intelligence that suggested otherwise was forced to fit that narrative. Germany was too weak, too depleted to strike. Koch did not assume victory. He asked what the evidence indicated, no matter how uncomfortable the conclusion. His analysis pointed to danger, not safety. Intelligence alone accomplishes nothing unless a commander acts. Koch's assessments reached multiple headquarters, most treating them as an interesting but unlikely scenario. Only one leader took it seriously enough to act, George S. Patton. He did not merely listen to his intelligence officer. He wagered the posture of his entire army on Koch's judgment when almost everyone else believed it was wrong. He devoted time, staff effort, and resources to prepare for a crisis that might never occur. And when the crisis came, that preparation allowed Third Army to do what no other force could: pivot instantly and strike back with overwhelming speed. At Verdun, other generals had stared in disbelief when Patton calmly promised an attack within 48 hours. To them, it seemed like bravado. In reality, Patton had been quietly aligning every element for 11 days. He wasn't boasting. He was stating what he already knew his army could achieve. Official histories praised Third Army's relief of Bastogne, but the 11 days of unseen preparation are often a footnote. Koch's name rarely appears outside specialized studies, despite the fact that his Ardennes assessment was among the most accurate intelligence predictions of the war. For students of command and decision-making, the lesson is enduring. Intelligence matters only when leaders are willing to question assumptions and act before events force their hand. Preparation is rarely glamorous. It earns no parades, no medals. Yet in moments of crisis, it is the difference between improvisation and execution. The Battle of the Bulge exposed the failures of Allied intelligence at the highest levels, but it also highlighted a crucial truth. Most commanders saw the same reports and dismissed the threat, while Patton and Koch read the facts and acted as if everyone else could be wrong. When German forces slammed into the Ardennes, Third Army was ready. Not because Patton was reckless or lucky, but because he planned for the unthinkable, trusting an intelligence officer who saw what others refused to acknowledge. Victories in war are often attributed to courage, firepower, or sheer will. All of those were present at Bastogne: the paratroopers who refused to surrender, the tank crews who broke through, the infantry advancing through snow and artillery fire. But none of it would have been possible without a commander who anticipated the impossible before it arrived. That is why George S. Patton was the only general truly prepared for the Battle of the Bulge, and why the story of Bastogne is not only one of desperation and heroism, but of foresight, trust, and meticulous preparation, carried out quietly 11 days before the first shell fell. If you enjoyed this story, leave a like, subscribe to the channel, and comment where you're watching from. See you in the next video.